Matthew Griffith, tell us, well, just give us some background on who you are. Where'd you grow up? Where are you from?
So I was originally born in Raleigh, North Carolina. Lived there with my parents, 2 brothers, 1 younger, 1 older, until I was 5. At which time we moved to Alpharetta, Georgia, right down the road from Roswell. Lived there until I left for college. Went to Centennial High School, so obviously that's how I know you. I went to University of Georgia for undergrad. Then on to Florida State for grad school. And then I've lived in Greenville, South Carolina for much of my adult life, professional life.
Yeah, we first met in high school, right? Did we ever meet prior to high school? Maybe in passing in middle school or something?
Yeah, I think I played against you in basketball, like Roswell Rec or something. In middle school.
How was I?
Well, I remember you because you had sprained your wrist or broken your wrist or something, and you wore like one of those soft casts. And I remember having to get rebounds against you, and afterwards my arms were all torn up because the Velcro on your wrist. That's my first memory of you in 8th grade. I think it was 8th grade.
Broken wrist? I must have been 7th grade.
Or 7th grade.
I broke it trick-or-treating on rollerblades.
That's about right.
Yeah. Damn. Yeah, so we're recording this from the rooftop of Matt's
penthouse apartment
apartment building here in Greenville. Apparently the world's about to come to an end. So we knew each other, I guess, in passing in middle school, and then got to know each other better in high school, but really became good friends in college.
Yeah.
What brought your family to Roswell? Why did y'all move from Raleigh to Roswell?
My dad's job. He worked in telecom sales, so he worked for a company, Nortel, who's basically sold equipment, I guess, to companies like AT&T, Bell South. And so Bell South, I guess it was Bell South, was headquartered in Atlanta, and so that's kind of what brought us to Atlanta. We're very close to moving to Denver, like a year before that.
Oh, for real?
And one of my dad, I guess it was somebody that worked above him that knew him and like knew that he had a young family. This job opportunity came up in Denver, and I think he was about to take it. He was about to like make the phone call to take it and move to Denver with his, his young family. And this guy was looking out for him, and he said, "Hey, I know this is a great job opportunity, but I have an inkling that the same opportunity is going to open up in Atlanta shortly. So hold on tight, and you may not have to move so far away."
Oh shit!
So we ended up in Alpharetta.
Yeah, and you mentioned you have two siblings, so an older brother and a younger brother.
Yep.
Like, what are they, 2 years on either side-ish?
Yeah, Philip, my older brother, is 2.5 years older than me, and Grace 2 years younger.
2 years younger than you.
Yeah.
What about your mom? What did she do growing up?
She grew up in Durham, North Carolina. She, we always make fun of her. She kind of had like a beaver cleaver kind of childhood. Her father worked for American Tobacco. Because Durham is basically that city was built on tobacco. My mom's mom was a stay-at-home mom. She grew up in Durham, went to University of North Carolina, married my dad, started dating my dad when she was a sophomore in high school.
Oh, damn.
And they stayed together all throughout college, and when she graduated, they got married like that in November. He was a year older, so he'd been working for a year.
Did she ever work when y'all were growing up?
She was a substitute teacher for a few years when I was like in middle school.
But for the most part, I was like a housewife?
Yeah, she was at home. Yep.
What was your relationship with your parents like growing up?
I'd say I'm very close with both of my parents, more so my mom. Even now, I talk to my mom probably 3 times a week. Yeah, I'd say I had a pretty close relationship.
How often do you talk to your dad?
I don't ever just call my dad specifically to talk. He's not big on talking on the phone. But, every now and then when I'm talking to my mom, she'll hand it to my dad. And then I go home. Now that we're in Greenville, we go home once every couple months probably.
Okay. And you with your brothers growing up, how's your relationship with them?
It was always pretty good. Me and Gray, being pretty close in age and having a lot of similar interests as far as sports and stuff goes, we could be competitive with each other, but we were always pretty tight. Had a good relationship with Philip too. He was the oldest though, and his interests were always much different than ours. Gray and I, our family was very big into like baseball, Braves games and whatnot. Philip wasn't so much into that.
Mm-hmm.
And you're fine. And he actually went on to get his PhD in French literature. So,
yeah, you weren't big into French literature growing up?
I actually minored in French, but I wasn't as big into it as he was.
That's what I was going for. So there was never any like hostile or like major sibling rivalries between y'all growing up, or major family issues for the most part. It was like a pretty smooth sailing childhood.
Pretty smooth sailing for the most part.
Yeah, we were having this conversation yesterday, right, at the pool about, a couple of days ago, you and the two of us and your wife, about friends of ours that come from divorce or come from broken homes. And I felt like you and your wife Jeannie were making the case that like that's pretty common. Mm-hmm. But then I started running down like my top 10 friends, and I think I got like only one of them that didn't come from a complete like nuclear family.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that means. I guess we come from a good area though. I mean, we grew up in suburban Atlanta.
Yeah. It's true. But I remember I kind of started to do the same thing in my head, and I was kind of thinking, yeah, I don't know why I thought it seemed that way. Different points in my life, even going back to like middle school, high school, I feel like I was always somewhat sensitive to that. Like when I did have friends, because I mean, especially at that age, I feel like you can kind of notice, like if
you were sensitive, like when it would pop up, you'd be like, that fucking weirdo.
No, more like I could just kind of, I felt bad for him because
right.
I felt like I had it pretty good, and I felt bad for my friends that didn't necessarily have it the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, all of my closest friends are like that. I don't know. I guess in a lot of ways, though, I'm definitely not like the standard kid that grew up in a single-parent household. I think my mom did a phenomenal job. I talked about this on the last podcast with Hunter, though. I definitely feel, though, we started talking about like my future plans for like having a family and things like that. I want to get into that with you in a little bit. But I think for the most part, like my mom did a good job of like making sure that none of us are maniacs, and we all grew up, I think, to be productive members of society. I'm probably the least productive member of society of the three of us that grew up. But I definitely feel like, especially now as I'm like becoming an actual adult, I'm 30 years old, that there's some major holes in who I am as an individual. And like how, I don't want to say unstable, whatever the word is, my life is, but like I definitely feel, for instance, doing this podcast and kind of going on this journey where I'm like bouncing from city to city, visiting friends for the next several months without, essentially homeless, right? I think it's like there's some sort of like searching or longing. There's something I'm looking for here. And I wonder how much of that would have been mitigated if I had grown up with a father in my household. Then again, whenever I bring it up with my mom, she's like, your dad's might have not been the ideal paternal figure to have in your life, so maybe it's a blessing in disguise. Yeah. Anyway, but it's good to get your perspective on that from a kid that grew up with a pretty fucking stable, ideal childhood for the most part. Yeah. All right, so let's get into when we first met. So, like I said, we went to high school together, and then I transferred into University of Georgia my sophomore year, and another friend of ours who I'll be visiting this week. We lived together because we both transferred in, and then you and I moved in
the next year, junior year.
Junior year?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we started living together junior year.
Yep.
And you still, tell us what you studied. Tell us about your academic career at UGA.
So at Georgia, I started out as a journalism major, actually, my first semester. And then my second semester, I'd always been interested in psychology, and I always kind of figured that would play some sort of role. So I ended up adding a double major, psychology and journalism, second semester freshman year, and then I dropped the journalism my sophomore year.
What were you thinking with journalism when you came in?
Honestly, I probably wanted to be like Rick Riley, like that kind of thing.
Dude, that's the same thing I did. When I started at South Carolina, I went in as a mass communication major just because sports is the only thing I knew. It's the only thing I knew about the planet.
Yeah.
Like outside of my immediate existence, I didn't know anything about like politics or,
Yeah.
I did relatively well in school, so I knew the basic facts that I was taught in, K-12 public education, but the only thing I felt I had any expertise in was sports.
Yeah. Well, and also, I liked I was the same way. I wasn't all that up with, politics and all that kind of stuff. But I liked the guys like Rick Riley, who's the dude that always does like the human interest stories on
Tom Rinaldi,
like that kind of stuff. I always thought that would be pretty cool, like travel around and meet people and write kind of stories like that.
Yeah, actually, now that we're talking about it, I guess maybe I had a more accurate depiction of who I was as an individual back then. My interest in sports certainly has waned, but like the only thing I've ever felt, and we'll get into education in a second, but I've never, and that's what I've done primarily, and for my professional career, adult life, and that's what you do as well. But I've never felt like passionate about education, like when you enter like some kind of flow state or something. And the only time in my life I've ever felt, or during my childhood, that I ever felt like I was like, man, I'm doing what I should be doing right now. I feel like I'm like in some sort of like transcendent state. It was playing sports. Mm-hmm. And then in my adult life, the only time where I've felt a similar feeling is doing like little personal projects like this. When I'm interviewing family members, when I'm like making little videos for like some of the work I did down in Honduras, when I help those kids like produce some like photojournalism projects and things like that. And over the past now 3 weeks since I've been doing these series of interviews, moving away from family members now into close friends, like it feels, I don't know, it feels very much in line with who I am, and like it resonates, something's resonating in like my being on a deeper level that I can't quite describe, that I never felt certainly in any type of academic setting, and that I never felt even as an educator, even though I was super dedicated as an educator when I was doing it. So maybe I was onto something when I initially did journalism stuff. Because
that's also funny because you were a good student. I mean, I know you had things that made school hard for you sometimes, but you're always a good student. I mean, some of the things you're saying, you often hear from kids who, just completely flopped in school.
Right.
Not do very well.
Yeah, I'm a disciplined guy, ironically enough. I mean, in some ways in my life. Like, once I got over all the OCD stuff, I was super disciplined in my academic life. And that was probably an offshoot of OCD in large regard. Now that I'm not a student, I'm super disciplined in like with my physical being, like my nutrition and exercise regimen and shit like that. But then in other ways in my life, no discipline whatsoever. I'm just like a leaf, floating in the wind. But yeah, I was a good student, but it was just like because I had a task in front of me that needed to be completed. And I knew it needed to be completed. It wasn't like because, oh man, like I'm loving this right now. Yeah. Anyway, okay, so junior year you moved away from journalism, did you say? And you did psychology full time? Did you drop journalism at some point? You dropped journalism at some point, right?
Midway through sophomore year, I dropped it and went kind of all in with psychology.
And what was your thought process then?
So growing up at a very young age, I remember, I guess not very young, but I remember a 9th grade English class. You probably took the same class. We weren't in the same class.
Record?
No, it was, I can't remember who the teacher was, but we wrote papers. Like our big research paper for the year was like, research a career and write about it, like find out about the education requirements, salary.
Dude, I do remember this paper. Hunter and I talked about this paper on the last podcast.
Did you really?
It was the first, I remember writing that paper, and it was the first time as a 9th grader that I like acknowledged that I wasn't, to myself and to like the outside world, that I wasn't going to be a professional athlete. And I remember I poured out my heart and soul in this fucking paper. To me, it was like this super, not really cathartic, but really kind of like painful, but very introspective process to write this fucking paper. And I remember like turning it in like, man, that's like the most powerful, profound thing I've ever written. I've never engaged in like that sort of self-reflection and put it down in paper or whatever, or express it to anyone. And I remember I got like a 72. Motherfucker.
What career did you put, or did you choose?
I don't remember. I think maybe that's why I got a 72. I think I just started rambling about how disappointing it was to come to terms with the fact that I wasn't going to be like, a fucking wide receiver. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, but what's funny that paper meant so much to some people. I'm kind of curious what Hunter wrote about, but I remember, because at that age you're still kind of like you're kind of in between.
Right.
So it's not like we had a lot of guys in there writing about being an accountant one day.
Right.
So at that point, my peers, I think my 2 or 3 best friends in the class were writing about being like a Navy SEAL or like a Marine or an FBI agent, kind of thing. And I remember writing about how I wanted to be a psychologist.
Really?
So I researched all these different types of jobs in psychology, and I guess then I got involved with the newspaper a couple years after that, and ended up being the editor of a newspaper. So I kind of was like, oh well, I have all this on my resume, might as well pursue the journalism thing. I always enjoyed writing, but then I just kind of got back to what I'd always been interested in.
Right. So my mom's a school psychologist, so obviously you're well aware of.
She's a big reason how I got into it, actually.
For real?
Yeah. She let me shadow her that one day, remember?
Oh, yeah. I do remember that. But I guess I had a lot of psychological issues growing up, so I was familiar with psychology. But I remember we were fortunate enough to go to a good suburban school, but like my first introduction to like the study of psychology, which I found fucking fascinating, it probably wouldn't, was our AP psychology class senior year. You were in that class, right? Yeah. I think we're in the same class.
Yeah.
Was that any impetus? But it sounds like you already had an interest in psychology prior to that.
It's funny, it wasn't an impetus, but it was, it was the first, and I've talked to you about this a little bit, but it was the first time, it's kind of silly, but it just kind of goes to show, I guess, how the brain develops and how you're just not very aware of things when you're a certain age. But it's the first time reading a textbook. Literally, I remember reading like the study guide or something. You remember we'd always have those quizzes?
Yeah.
Reading about like anxiety disorders, and I was like, holy shit. This is exactly what I've been dealing with. And it's not just some random thing. It's like something that happens to millions of people.
You want to get into that?
Sure. So yeah, that obviously, I feel like I was always very interested in psychology, just kind of like you might have been as well. Just, human behavior, learning about how people think, that kind of thing.
Dude, I wasn't.
Really?
Well, that's right. I'm kind of looking back on it now like I should have been, because I was going fucking crazy 6th grade through 12th grade.
Yeah.
I felt like I was losing my mind. But I know in hindsight, the way, and I would like to get into the issues that you experienced as well, but for me at least, the OCD was so bad and so prevalent and so overwhelming that it honestly didn't leave any sort of like cognitive or intellectual energy or capacity to like be interested in anything else. Yeah. I'm telling you, 6th grade through 12th grade was literally like get through the fucking day. Yeah. Like when I wake up, let's get to fucking work, man. Let's go to battle with these compulsions or whatever it is, all fucking day, every second of every day. And even, and I mentioned this in my podcast with my mom, like even at times during sleep, it's like dreaming. You're dreaming some sort of like real world scenario, or even not a real world scenario, like you're fighting a dragon or something, and you've got to like pick up your sword like 50 fucking times or whatever. So yeah, man, that's what I was, back to the sports thing. Sports was always like a huge distraction for me.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I don't have to pay attention to my actual fucking what's going on in my head right now. I can watch, whatever sport's going on. Honestly, man, I think I was a relatively smart kid growing up, and I had the ability to be successful in school, but there was no like exploration of any other topic aside from just surviving the day and then being interested in sports as a form of distraction.
As far as the whole OCD thing, do you think, I'm sure at a younger age, you were at least made aware of what it was because of your mom, or did she kind of keep it from you? Because you told me before that she had an inkling.
Yeah. And so she goes into this in her podcast as well, or her interview. She definitely had an inkling. Like, she definitely knew something was wrong. And she tells a story where the first time, she always noticed things. And I talked to Hunter about this a little bit as well, because Hunter was essentially like a brother of mine. So he was always around. So I asked him the same thing. Like, dude, did you ever notice that like something was off with me? And he said like, yeah, kind of towards the end of high school, we would notice things, but we just thought it was like Alex being quirky or whatever. Mm-hmm. My mom noticed things like towards the end of elementary school, beginning of middle school, but she tells a story for the first time she ever remembered it, where it kind of hit her like a ton of bricks that like, oh fuck, this is an issue, was when I was doing algebra homework at our like dining room table in 7th grade, and I never asked my mom for help. I always just like to do my shit on my own. If it was totally over my head for whatever reason, yeah, maybe bring her to help, or like a science fair project, help me like cut shit out and glue shit or whatever. But like for the most part, I like to do everything on my own. And so that was the first clue, was like I called her in from the kitchen, like, hey mom, can you come help me with this problem? And she was like, he never asked for this kind of stuff. And so she comes over and she's like, yeah, what's the problem? Like, you don't understand? And I was like, no, I understand it. I just like, I can't do it. But I didn't want to say, I knew I was fucking crazy, but I didn't, as a 12-year-old, you have a lot of pride, and I couldn't express that, especially to my mom, because I knew she'd, worry her ass off. But then she looks down at my paper, and she just sees the number 1 is the first problem of the homework, written all on every single line, but then scratched out all the way down the paper, and then flipped over all the way down the back of the paper, then like down the next center column.
Didn't take a psychology degree.
Yeah, she's like, oh fuck. And so then she was just like, stand up, I'll sit down and I'll write it, and I just talked her through the whole all the problems on the homework.
Yeah.
But I just couldn't physically write it. And she took me to see a psychologist in 7th grade. But as soon as we got in, dude, first off, I refused to go in there. Yeah, sure. The first time I was like, one of the few times in my life I was just like a petulant child. Like, I refused to first I refused to leave the parking lot. Then I refused to leave the waiting room. I remember the first appointment, I got 5 minutes in, and she started pressing me on the issues I was having. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't fucking admit it was an issue. I just slammed the door. I think I probably cursed in front of my mom for the first time. I'm like, fuck this, I'm not doing this, and ran out to the parking lot and hid behind cars. I went back to that psychologist a couple times, but every single time I downplayed the issue. Yeah. No, it's not big of a deal. I can remember very specifically, one of my big things was whenever I would take off my shoes, one would have to be lined. They have to be lined up right next to each other, but in opposite directions, like they come in the shoebox. Mm-hmm. And it all had to be like that. And my mom had told her that she had noticed that. So she's like, take off your shoes. She'd take off my shoes. She's like, I want you to put them facing the same direction, side by side, on the other side of the room. And so I did. And she's like, does that bother you? I remember sitting there, no. But inside my head, I'm like, oh, fucker. I'm going to jump out of my skin. So she tried to, man, a couple times. I think maybe I went to one other psychologist, but no more than maybe 5 to 7 appointments. And I know my mom feels real bad about this in hindsight because she is a psychologist. She feels like she should have done more. It didn't have to get as bad as it was. She's really torn on whether or not she should have medicated me. But to her credit, or in her defense, I had developed expertise in hiding that shit. And whenever anyone confronted me about it, her or psychologist or anyone, I'd downplay the shit out of it and just say it wasn't an issue. So yeah, what was your experience with that stuff?
So my issue, I guess, I started having panic attacks when I was very young.
Mm-hmm. What age?
I remember a couple when I was very young, maybe soon after we had just moved to Atlanta when I was 5, but that was more separation anxiety. I remember that specifically would be a day when I'd been dropped off at church, and I remember just freaking out. I'd never been that kind of kid that had separation anxiety, but I just remember freaking out.
This was early, it was kindergarten?
Yeah, I was 5. Okay. But when I really started having them and it became an issue, and I was just kind of old enough to be what the hell is going on, I was in 4th grade. And that's when it was pretty recurrent. It got to where, and I'm not even sure if panic disorder would be the right diagnosis, because it got to where it just became more generalized. And especially as I got into high school, because you worry so much about having a panic attack in these certain situations that you end up just worrying all the time. Mm-hmm. So 4th grade was really rough. 5th grade, it got a little bit better. And then middle school, I was fine. For whatever reason, 6th or 8th grade, I was pretty much fine. Mm-hmm. And then it got really bad sophomore year of high school, to where I didn't even want to leave the house. The summer after freshman year of high school, I doubt I left the house more than
summer between sophomore and junior year?
Somewhere between freshman and sophomore, yeah. So it was the very end of freshman year, bled into the summer, and then sophomore year of high school, it's where it affected me the most, as far as at school, socially, that kind of thing. And then, junior year, I was still dealing with it all throughout high school. It made high school very difficult. But then, senior year, and I was always a pretty smart kid. I thought I was pretty in tune with socially intelligent. I think I was probably a pretty empathetic kid, but it's so funny just how limited you are at a certain age to kind of understand what's going on in your own head. To me, I was just like, when I was very young, I was like, God's punishing me for something, for whatever reason.
I used to think that same shit.
Yeah. Because that's the only way you could attribute it. And so I had that feeling for a while. I wore this WWJD bracelet for like 3 years straight, and I hated taking it off. I remember one day I forgot it before school, and I freaked out, and my mom did not know why I was freaking out. She made me go to school anyway. And so I was just like,
oh, fuck.
I remember just sitting there in homeroom.
She's going to be so pissed.
I ended up being all right, but yeah, it's just crazy looking back. Yeah, I was just reading, an AP psychology book, and I was like, oh shit, this is describing me completely.
Right.
And it was a mix of shame, but also like, holy shit, like there's an explanation. It's not just God isn't just mad at me. I have something. The wiring is just a little bit different.
Yeah, man, that's a scary thing, and I don't know, I don't know where this podcast is going to go or how many people actually listen to it. But man, if there's, and I always try to start each school year, especially the last 2 years I've taught middle school and high school, with some sort of spiel. Like, listen, if there's something, you feel like there's something off in your head, and it's like significantly hindering your life, and it's making you a less happy person, like say something, reach out to somebody, like you're not a fucking like freak. Yeah. But that's the same thing I thought, man. As you said, something's wrong, like something's off, but you either attribute it, to like a higher power, which I remember going through that thought process as well. In my case as well, it was kind of a vicious cycle, because it's like, oh, I'm keep fucking having these issues because I'm not doing these compulsions right. Yeah. So it's like you think the solution is the fucking problem, and you just don't know, man. You have no experience, and like you said, not. The two of us are very similar in a lot of ways. We were both academically successful. We were both athletically successful, and we were both, socially intelligent and had, we're fairly popular kids throughout school. So there's also this, at least in my case, this like pride thing where it's like, wait a second, I'm supposed to be getting A's. I'm supposed to be like making every soccer team or football team or whatever. And I'm supposed to be like have a lot of friends and have like girls interested in me. I can't have like some sort of like major issue. And then so you start to like ignore it. Like, no, this is not a problem. This will go away next week. Or like in my case, like if I do this if I wash my hands 67 times, like that'll get rid of it all. Yeah. And I just need to do this one last compulsion. The amount of times where I told myself like, no, this is the last thing I need to like, compulsive exercise I need to go through, and then I'll be cured. Mm-hmm. Dude, I told myself that for fucking like 7 years every day. Yeah. So yeah, man, if you're out there, young children or teenagers or adults, man, you know something's off, like look into it and go reach outside of yourself for assistance, because gritting your teeth and trying to like willpower your way through it is not easy and probably not going to be effective in the long run.
Yeah, and it is super hard to even find the words, especially at a certain age. I remember I tried to tell my mom about it. I was probably in 5th grade, and I tried, the best that I could put it into words was, sometimes when I'm at school, I feel like I need to cry, and I don't know why. And I can't control it, and I have to wait for it to pass. Mm-hmm. And that's the best that I could put it into, because the only way that I could describe that shitty feeling of just panic coming over you for whatever reason was it just made me feel like I needed to cry or wanted to cry, because I guess it was so uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But that's the best way that I could put it into words. So I think her response was, "Oh, it's okay. Everybody cries sometimes," and then that's it. I never brought it up again because I just didn't really. It's hard to find the words to.
Yeah, so is that the same? Have you ever found a better way to describe it than that? Because that was my next question. I've never had panic attack issues. What is that? What is that like? It's like a sense of impending doom.
Yeah, and for me, mine started. I used to describe it as like a social claustrophobia. Like it would be when I was in social situations, usually like big crowds, where I couldn't escape, or I couldn't escape without drawing a lot of attention to myself. So like when I was in fourth grade, the I guess the settings that would cause them were typically like even like a guidance lesson. Like say the guidance counselor came in. Remember how they used to do that like once a month or whatever?
Yeah.
And the guidance counselor would come in, and I felt either uncomfortable or I felt that it would be rude to like excuse myself for any reason, and so I would just sit there just terrified that I was going to have another panic attack. Like, and then you just worry about it so much that it's just it just gets so much worse in your head, and then over time that fear started to translate to other settings, like even just one-on-one conversations, or like as you get older, interviews or sitting through a test. Even though I wasn't nervous about like the content of a test, it was like sitting through an AP exam, knowing that you're not allowed to like get up. I just felt AP exams were horrible. Like I had to psych myself up literally the entire year. AP World History, we had that class together, didn't we? With
the guy with the beard,
Dr. Ruther.
Yeah.
I remember the very first week of school, because that's when the anxiety got really bad in sophomore year, and I'm sure it was a mix of the hormones and all the other stuff that was going on. Just kind of amped everything up. But I remember the first week of school when he was like telling us about how we would have to take the AP exam in May 5th. I had it written in my calendar. I still remember it.
Got 8 months.
But that's how ridiculous it was. Like that, every time I would hear that date or hear anything about an AP exam, this just feeling of dread and anxiety would just like wash over me.
Right.
And so that's when it started to get bad. If it's just isolated panic attacks, I could avoid, and especially now that I'm an adult, I could just avoid those types of situations. But it got to where, and again, hormones I'm sure played a part of it, you just start to worry so much about the worry just kind of consumes you.
Right, so it's not even necessarily the panic attack itself, it's the fear of the panic attack that's probably the more like prevalent symptom?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it just generalized.
And then the panic attack itself, like did it actually ever manifest into like an episode or an event? Or is it just constant concern that some kind of episode is going to happen?
Yeah, it would, but from what I've read about panic attacks, typically they last a lot longer, and they're, I don't know if they're more severe, but they last a lot longer. Mine would typically be over within a minute. It's just the buildup would be there, and then finally it's like you hit a switch, and it's complete panic mode. And your heart is racing, you get tunnel vision, you just feel like kind of like you're losing control. You're very much in your own head. Everything sounds like it's down a tunnel. And it's just a horrible feeling of just impending doom, but also just sadness, like hopelessness. Like this is how I'm going to feel forever. And then it's over within, in my case, a few seconds most of the time. But then sometimes it would be like rapid cycling. Like I would calm down, and just naturally your body kind of calms itself down and you feel okay. But then if I'm still stuck in that situation, once my body's ready to ramp up again, it would happen again.
And it's only going to happen in situations where there's other people around. Would it ever happen if you're alone?
See, I don't think so. Sometimes I think about I'm like the elevator at this place, for example, sucks, and like I always think, man, I could easily get stuck in this elevator literally anytime I get in it, but I don't think I would have like a claustrophobic kind of reaction if I was by myself. It was all typically having a crowd of people around and not being able to escape are the two things that caused it, especially when I was very young. And then, like I said, it generalized as I got older.
And so you would have actual, like, where it actually would manifest itself, the vision closing in, like an acute event happening in elementary school, that happened in high school?
Yeah, a ton.
Has it happened college, adult life?
It did in college. So I never sought treatment. The one time that I ever told my mom, when I told her I felt like I wanted to cry at school or whatever.
That was in 5th grade though, right?
It was like 5th grade or something. I never brought it up again until sophomore year or junior year of college, when I had been paying out of pocket myself to go to the student center, to the counseling. I guess you could get a couple free sessions of counseling, and after that it's just cheap. So I've probably been doing that for a while.
They definitely give you a free one if you get arrested.
I know that for a fact. You got a few free ones, I think.
Dude, that happened? No, it actually happened. They don't give you a free one if you get arrested. You have to get an alcohol screening from like a nurse. And then if you're honest with them about the amount of alcohol you're consuming, which is like 50 beers a week, then they give you a free one.
Well, it's funny. I know people are listening. You can't see this, but Alex is wearing a somewhat baggy, light tan long sleeve shirt right now, and his arms are crossed, and he looks like he's in a straight jacket. As he's laughing and talking about his psychiatric evaluations that were court ordered.
And run-ins with law enforcement. It's fucking cold up here, bro. Give me a break. Sorry, anyway, so yeah, so the first time you sought formal treatment was when we were living together at UGA and you were going to the counseling, just like UGA Counseling Center?
It was actually, so the part of junior year, the second semester you were in Monroe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was that semester when I started going.
You fell apart without me.
I just fell apart without you, and I'd call and you wouldn't answer. And so, yeah, I sought treatment that way, went to a few counseling sessions. It really kind of made things worse for me just because talking about it. I remember just being so anxious and stressed afterwards because I'd just be just kind of ruminating on what we had talked about. And I probably didn't give it enough time, but I ended up going to a psychiatrist and trying the medication route, which was
right around the same time.
Yeah, very effective.
Dude, that's crazy because we've never talked about this in great detail, but that's essentially the same story and timeline as all my issues, man. Because they started bad end of elementary school, middle school. I never sought treatment for them, other than like my mom forced me to go to those few sessions with a psychologist. And then I remember it was sophomore year when I first transferred to UGA. Freshman year at South Carolina, I had that whole summer prior, and I know I just talked about like don't grit your teeth and try to willpower your way through it, but that whole summer prior, I just convinced myself every day it was like a training camp. I'm gonna get over this. I'm gonna get over this. Ignore the compulsion. Ignore the voice in your head that's telling you to do whatever you need to do to like reduce, somehow solve this problem. Don't wash your hand. Wash your hand one time. Brush your teeth one time. That type of shit. Like read this sentence and don't go back and read it again. Like it was like training camp that whole summer, and then once I got to South Carolina, and maybe it helped that I knew no one there, and it was just like, dude, I can just use this year as just like a trial period to like start anew. I did just try to willpower my way through it all, and I think I did a really successful job, man. Honestly, I think I probably reduced my symptoms 75 to 90%. But then when I transferred back to UGA, after like the first couple months of school, shit started coming up again, and I was like rereading sentences over and over, engaging all these compulsions. And I remember I was reading some book in my bed in my apartment at Rivermill, and having to I spent like 90 minutes reading the same page. I was like, motherfucker, I feel like I'm fucking 8th grade again. And that was the first time I remember picking my phone, dial my mom. That was the first time I was like, yeah, Mom, I know you probably have been aware of something that's been going on my whole life, but I need fucking help. I need something. Can you like get in contact with somebody you know? Yeah. And that next week took me to see a psychiatrist and put me on
Zoloft or something?
Prozac. And that was just a total game changer. Yeah. Total game changer. The way I describe it, man, was like your brain, when shit is hitting the fan, at least with OCD, and maybe this out is with anxiety disorders in general, but it's like your brain is this castle, and it's under constant attack by like marauders and barbarians who are trying to enter it. And they're, throwing their hooks over the fucking wall and going through the moat, and they're shooting flaming arrows, and they're just constantly trying to burn down your castle. And the only thing that you can do if you're trying to willpower it, like my freshman year in South Carolina, was like, okay, I'm just gonna build a really big fucking wall and a really big fucking moat. But all those fucking intruders are still there trying to get it. I'm just like constantly refortifying this wall. Yeah. And every now and then one of them's gonna get over, but I just gotta keep this wall erect at all times. Once I got into medicine, it was like all the invaders that are trying to like get inside the castle just disappeared. You just had this beautiful castle like sitting on this hillside, and there's no need for a wall and a moat anymore, So that's how it was for me. And
a little ad for Prozac.
yeah, dude. But that's the other thing. I want to add like an addendum to that, because and maybe this is really fucking stupid on my part. Maybe I should just, and maybe it's a problem more generally with my personality. Like maybe I should just be satisfied with having a relative solution, because it certainly has helped, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. But I'm not satisfied being on the medicine. Just like it's like, I don't know, you know, just like I want to like keep traveling, going to all these cities, just like I love my now ex-girlfriend, but I'm not satisfied in the relationship. It's like I always have to be like looking for something else, another way to do it, a better way to do it, a different way to do it. I can't just like be satisfied and happy like, oh, this medicine's working. Yeah. There's something about it, like I want to find a more natural way, or I don't know, I feel like I'm masking something by taking the medicine, and shit, man, I've tried to go off it twice since college, since 2010, and both of those times were fucking disastrous. Yeah. And disastrous, man. But to me, that like lends even more credence that I should get off of it. Because then it's like, well, fuck, now I'm an addict to it. So clearly this isn't a good thing to be on. Yeah. So it's still, even though I know, it, based on past experience, that being off it's not going to produce good results, I'm like, well, shit, that probably means I need to find a more effective solution to being off of it. Yeah. So anyway, what's your experience? When did you start taking your medicine, and how's your experience with that been? And
it was pretty easy in terms of not having any side effects. I've been on the same medication that I started on, just generic Celexa, citalopram. Mm-hmm. Pretty much the same dose I'm still on that I started back junior year of college. I tried to come off a couple times too. And it wasn't a very good experience either. And it was like different things. I mean, the anxiety would get a little bit worse, but it was more like I started feeling depressed, like really irritable and angry all the time. Which I know to a certain point, it's probably the withdrawal and you can get through it, but it was bad enough to where I was just like, I can't afford to lose, you know, just the next few weeks of my life being an asshole and feeling this way. But I struggle the same way. I mean, for the first few years that I was on the medication, I probably tried to hide it. And I still do, probably to an extent. But I mean, it's helped me. I haven't had to do therapy. It's been pretty effective by itself, which I'm very fortunate. But also, I think a lot of it, I've grown a lot. A lot of the issues, obviously, that caused some of the anxiety or childhood issues that I feel like are behind me for the most part. So
yeah, man. And the same thing too. When I would go off it, it wouldn't be as if like those traditional OCD symptoms would return. It wasn't like I'd go off it and all of a sudden I need to wash my hands 100 times again or whatever, you know, or I can't like dress myself without like going through some sort of like song and dance OCD routine to put on my clothes. It's the same thing. It's like everything becomes like a lot more anxiety producing, and like everything becomes daunting. In my experience, it's and once again, I think a large part of it is like you grow out of it. So in my case, it's like I'm a grown man now, and I was a grown man when I've attempted to go off it. So you can rationalize your way through things. Mm-hmm. Like for instance, when I was growing up, a big reason I would feel like compelled to do these like behaviors, these OCD behaviors, whatever it was because I would think in my mind, if I don't do this, something horrible is going to happen. Right. So I remember it started in 5th grade, where it was like I had to walk a certain way home in the exact same path and not step on like certain areas of the path that I would walk home on. And if I didn't do that, my mom would die in a car accident on the way home. Yeah. And so it was like I am ensuring my mom's safe return on a daily basis by walking down this path, right? So it's like this huge existential thing you think. And then it would evolve into things like, okay, if I don't engage in this compulsion, like I won't ever like say a funny joke ever again. Like no one will ever think I'm funny. Or like, if I don't do this compulsion, I'll never score another goal in soccer or something like that. It was like some part of me is going to be lost forever if I don't engage in these compulsions. Right, so when I got off the medicine in my mid-20s, I guess you've grown up. Like you realize, like, okay, that's fucking ridiculous, right? If I can put on my shoes however I want to put on my shoes, and it's not going to, have any effect on my life. But there now is like, there still is some sort of horrible deleterious effect from coming off it, to where it's like just thinking about having to get out of the bed in the morning and make breakfast and then get dressed, get in my car, go to work. It's like everything just seems like the most overwhelming task imaginable. And then in my case as well, it also would get combined with like decision-making things. So then I'd wake up and it would be time to make breakfast. And I would spend 30 minutes deciding if I'm going to eat fucking granola or make eggs, And it would go like that all through the day. Like, should I take this route to work or this route to work? And then that seems like more classic OCD stuff, and that's entirely debilitating.
Yeah.
You're late for work every morning because you were spending 30 minutes deciding what you're going to eat. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of shit that would fuck me up when I was off my medicine. And then, like you said, like maybe you could just get through that or write it out. For me, at least, that sense of, one, everything seeming like overwhelming, even the smallest daily tasks seeming incredibly overwhelming, and then two, for me, the decision-making thing, like this inability to make a decision, is getting stuck in like this rut, bouncing back and forth, weighing the pros and cons of every little decision. All of that eventually adds up to this point, just like it did during my youth with OCD, where it's like, dude, fuck this, man. I'm not going to live like this anymore. I would rather be dead than live like this on a daily basis. And so I would ride it out off the medicine as long as I could to get to the point where I'm literally like pulling a razor blade out of my drawer and like thinking real hard about like what the best way to go about this would be. And then when you get to that point, you're like, fuck. Well, if there is a solution on the table and I know it's worked in the past, I guess I gotta get back on this shit.
Yeah.
And that's happened to me twice now.
Yeah. And I've had, my experience with psychiatrists was always the ones that worked at the health center at the university. So not to say that they're not quality psychiatrists, but maybe it's because of the clientele that they dealt with, but they never really, I always felt like they were pretty dismissive of my concerns about using medication. I would always, ask them if there were any long-term effects, or, is this the best course of treatment? Is my brain, gonna need this medication forever? And I always felt like I was never really satisfied with their answer, because they would use the analogy, it's just like if you have a vitamin deficiency, you're just taking a vitamin that your brain needs. And I was like, I don't know that that's really true. I'm not
that's
sure
the line you're always fed, man. And I think that's a great line. Like, that's what my mom would always tell me. My younger sister has type 1 diabetes, so she'd always be like, well, Morgan's pancreas doesn't work, so she needs to take insulin.
Yeah.
And like, your brain doesn't work, you need to take Prozac. That's a very comforting thing and a great justification, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I just think it's a lot more complicated and nuanced than that.
Yeah.
And especially the more we know about like neuroplasticity and how the brain can change, the more like essentially you train it like a muscle, I think it's possible to get off them. And especially the more I know now about like diet.
Yeah.
Dude, the shit I was eating growing up, man.
That's another thing.
That's like the biggest one for me, man. The amount of fucking sugar I used to put back as a kid, just like pounding soda, freeze Pop-Tarts, Star Crunches, everything. Eating Wendy's 5 days a week.
Yeah, dude. Calories was all you thought about, just being full.
Yeah, man. There's no concern whatsoever for what you're putting in your body. So,
when it's like, for me, the same kind of thing, the nutrition was a big part of it, but for me in college, I guess it was sophomore year when I started to have a hard time in college. It was my first year off the meal plan. Mm-hmm. And so, me and Joe were living together and like cooking chicken nuggets like we know nothing about, if I was full, I figured, okay, I'm feeding myself, good for me. And then my sleep habits were so messed up because like you and I, we'd go to the gym at like 11 o'clock at night, and then sleep until 1, get up for our 2 o'clock classes the next day. So it was a perfect storm of all kinds of stuff that, again, if you're not educated on and you don't really know, I wasn't smart enough to make that connection.
Yeah. Dude, the other thing for me, man, especially given the fact that I did feel like I was successful at South Carolina, kind of willing my way through it and just kind of going through this. I didn't ever see a psychologist to help me navigate it, but basically going through like your own personal cognitive behavior therapy, where you're like identifying the issue and then like rationalizing your way through the issue, like deconstructing how stupid your thinking on that issue is. And I was relatively successful with that at South Carolina my freshman year. And I had no friends at South Carolina. I knew no one when I got there, and as soon as I got there, I did not want to be there, and I knew I wasn't going to stay, and I knew my only task at hand was to just try, for the first time since basically 5th grade, try to be like a successful student where I'm actually can do the homework and reading the assignments. That was the only thing I fucking cared about. I was like, I'm just going to try to be a successful student and let OCD affect me as little as possible. So I wasn't partying, I wasn't staying out late for the most part. Then all of a sudden I get to UGA, link up with all my friends from high school, and then now their friends that they've made freshman year. And I didn't drink or like do drugs in high school. I didn't drink or do drugs freshman year. As soon as I get to UGA, dude, fucking went wild. Like that's just what everybody did. And I don't regret it because I had some of the best times of my life and I made some great friends and fantastic memories. And I'm glad I had the time of my life. But dude, how much did that play a role?
Yeah.
And I've certainly slowed down my partying since then, but I've never like given up drinking or partying. And my drug use my like illicit drug use has only increased. My marijuana use certainly has only increased in like the second half of my 20s.
Yeah.
So that certainly plays a role too, man. I mean, it's got to, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially because alcohol is a depressant. What do you envision? Like, when you think about this disorder, do you like going for the rest of your life? Do you feel like it's something that you're plagued with and is going like a central part of who you are?
Yes and no. At this point, I don't feel like I'm plagued with the disorder, but I do feel like it's pretty incredible how much something like that affects your worldview growing up, and I'm sure for you too. I mean, it's like an all-encompassing, like you said, it kind of bled into every part of your life.
Yeah.
And for me, I think about it all the time, whether or not, I'm kind of falling victim to the disorder by following the path that I've followed in my life, or if I'm just kind of doing
what do you mean by that?
I guess sometimes I wonder, typically like on days at work when I'm not having a great day, if I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Uh-huh.
And sometimes I do have the thought in my mind, maybe I was kind of hoodwinked into going down this path because of this negative thing that impacted me when I was younger. Because I mean, when people ask me how I got into school psychology, I mean, I have a pretty canned response of, I was always interested in psychology. At Georgia, I got the opportunity to work in the psychology department and kind of try out what kind of psychology I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the real reason, the deeper reason is the fact that, I had the issues with anxiety when I was younger. And I felt like even at the really awesome schools that I went to, I was never flagged in any way. Mm-hmm. I was never intervened with in any way.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just kind of always been my shtick that schools need to do more than just academics. That we need to start focusing more on, social emotional learning, be more aware of real life things as well.
All right, so let's get into that now too. That's a perfect segue. So you're a school psychologist now, and so tell people just essentially what a school psychologist does.
So a school psychologist, it's funny. When you become a school psychologist, or when you start going to grad school to become a school psychologist, pretty much everybody that you meet is a school psychologist or heard about it from like a family friend. It was a very similar situation. Like I knew what a school psychologist was because your mom obviously was a school psychologist, and she was nice enough to let me shadow her once or twice. So a school psychologist, a lot of the schools that we grew up in, they weren't as prevalent because typically the reason school psychologists are employed is because as a part of special education legislation, kids have to be identified with disabilities, and so a lot of time the identification falls on the school psychologist to do testing and be kind of the gatekeeper to say whether a kid is eligible for special education support or not. So that's kind of the general interpretation of the job, but in my mind it's much more just about being a mental health professional in the schools, kind of bridging the gap between education and mental health awareness. And as we get more progressive, the job that I have now, it's a very big district, and so we have more opportunities to try to be a mental health professional and not just a tester.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the complaint I would always hear from my mom is like there were times, I guess maybe go like ebbs and flows with the job, but like she was just running tests all the fucking time, and then I guess with each test you got to write a report about how the kid performed on the test.
Yeah. A lot of paperwork, a lot of meetings, and a lot of it you're not necessarily making a difference with the kid. A lot of it is just paperwork and red tape.
There's a lot of red tape. Yeah. Very bureaucratic. Yeah, so I want to dive into this topic because I didn't study education. I studied international affairs and Spanish, but I did a program outside of or after I graduated school that allowed me to become a teacher without studying education. And I was placed into a special education classroom. So I didn't really have much say in it. They just told me, they gave me like a 6-week boot camp, and like, you're going to go teach special education.
Good luck.
And special education, we should clarify for the uninitiated, is I think when you hear the term special education, at least I did prior to 2010 when I became a teacher. I think of kids that would used to be called mental retardation, or like kids with some sort of cognitive disability,
Down syndrome,
right?
That kind of thing, yeah.
Or like a kid in a wheelchair, right? But special education encompasses essentially any issue that would affect a kid's ability to learn,
or to just be successful at school.
Yeah, or be successful at school. Yeah, so even it wouldn't necessarily have to be academic. Mm-hmm. So that could be mental retardation or whatever it's called now. That could be autism. That could be ADHD. That could be a behavior issue, which is the kids that I worked with during the first 3 years of my career. What's in some states called an emotional disorder or emotional disability. That could be, they even have, and you'll have to kind of clarify some of this, but like not special ed, but like special ed light, you get a 504 plan. Mm-hmm. You get one for like breaking your arm, right? Yeah. So anything that's going to affect your performance in school is going to fall under the umbrella of special education. And so as a school psychologist, essentially your job is to like identify these kids in the general population of the school and make sure that they're getting the services they need.
Right.
Whether that's like literally being removed to another school,
right,
which is kind of an antiquated model, but based on the severity, whether that's just like receiving additional support in the classroom,
right,
and that could be like an extra teacher in the classroom, or that could just be like, something more informal, like the teacher checking in on him regularly, or like having weekly meetings with him or something like that.
Yeah.
Basically just coming up with, identifying a kid that may have an issue that's affecting his performance in school, socially or academically, and then coming up with a plan to mitigate that, whatever that issue is, as much as possible.
Right.
Okay.
Well said.
Thank you. How do you like your job? How do you view your job? And you can be as candid or uncandid as possible. I'm about to express some opinions.
Yeah.
But I know you're actively employed school psychologist, so you can censor yourself as much as possible. I won't, and you can just contribute whatever you want to say.
I mean, it's just like any other job. You have your good days and your bad days. It's very cyclical. I work summers. We have professional development, and we have a lot of evaluations to catch up on in the summers. A lot of most school psychologists don't work in the summers. They're kind of on the same schedule as teachers. So, I mean, if you were to ask me about my job satisfaction, busy season, which is like February, March, April, you might get a little bit of a different answer. But in the summertime, when I'm able to kind of slow down and take a step back, I love my job. I really do enjoy what I do. But I've found that I have to put forth a lot of extracurricular effort in order to do things that make me love my job, that make me find fulfillment. Things like getting trained in mindfulness and learning how to teach kids mindfulness, kind of establishing myself at my schools as somebody more than a tester. Making yourself visible, available to administrators and teachers and parents, to let them know that you're more than just a tester. So I do enjoy my job, but my job description as written on the website when you probably apply to be a school psychologist, that doesn't really do it for me. But I enjoy some of the extracurricular things.
So in order to get that satisfaction, you're having to for me, expand your role.
And that's for me. Some people are very happy with just doing the testing, which I mean,
test, write the report, identify the kids, go to the meeting.
Yeah, and assessment, it is really interesting. Obviously I got into school psychology. A lot of it was because I enjoyed psychological assessment. I enjoyed those classes that I took in college.
Yeah, so get into that real quick. I meant to ask that earlier. It would have been better for the narrative. How did you get into it? Because school psychology is working, obviously, directly with kids. Yeah. It's not like a traditional... You have to have an interest in working with children. It's not like, you're a psychological researcher, you're just like studying the brain or neurology or, aberrant behaviors. You're like working with kids and, you have to have that.
Yeah, yes and no. So, and I feel like we've talked about this before, and I thought you put it pretty well, just talking about how you don't necessarily enjoy working with the kids. You enjoy working for the kids, essentially. So, I love kids, but I was never the kind of person that was like, I just want a job where I can, be with kids all day.
Right, or that finger painting all day.
Directly work with kids, The reason I got into school psychology, so at Georgia, a very big public university, obviously, we had a very big psychology department that had all kinds of different disciplines, everything from social psychology to school psychology to clinical. And so I was able to be a research assistant in pretty much every single department. And so I kind of got to hands-on experience the different things that the psychologists that were above me would do, the different types of research they would do, the different settings they worked in. The last one that I worked in before I graduated was a school psychology lab, and I got to work in the schools, and I just really enjoyed working in the schools. So from a day-to-day standpoint, that was a big thing for me. But kind of on a larger scale, I always kind of going back to what I said about how, not that public school failed me, because none of my anxiety was ever addressed before I was 22 years old. It was more, I just feel like schools should be able to do more. And globally, if you look at other countries, and even the United States, we're a little bit behind the ball, but there's a lot of legislation being passed for social emotional learning and different curriculums to kind of focus on more than just reading, math, writing, all that kind of thing. So I definitely have always seen the value in, trying to make our systems better. And I feel like, mental health is such a prevalent issue in our society, at least in my opinion, and I think most people will probably agree with that these days based on everything that's been going on. To me, just logically, having, in terms of American citizens, the one time that you have a captive audience where you have complete influence over, or not complete, but a large deal of influence over how they are, how they learn, and how they are molded into being successful citizens. Obviously, in schools. After that, 18, we turn them loose. So I think we have a pretty big responsibility to make sure that we're doing more than just teaching them how to hold a pencil.
Yeah, man, that's. I'm really glad you said all that, because I think from the outside looking in, from an objective observer's perspective, neither of us would be identified, or people would think that we would be involved in education, working with kids on a daily basis. I don't think any of us express that sort of tendency or characteristic in how we express ourselves socially. Certainly not the way that we appear. And like you said, same thing for me, man. I got a work-study job senior year, helping kids who are struggling to read at a school in Athens. And it wasn't same thing. It wasn't I enjoyed working with kids. I don't like hanging out with people that are dumber than me and don't have any life experience. You have to just be. It's not I love people. I love hanging out with adults. I love making new friends. I love talking to people, obviously, about their life experiences, like what I'm doing right now with this podcast. I fucking love that. To me, I get no sort of enjoyment hanging out with, a half human. But I find it beyond the significance of intervening at a young age and ensuring that kids are being not necessarily raised in the right way, but at least educated and socialized in the best way possible is the surest way to ensure a brighter future, not only for them, but for the entire planet, for generations to come. And so that was my thinking going into it. It's man, I want to make a difference in the world, right? I want to have a positive impact on the planet. Is there a better way to do that than working with the future humans that are going to inhabit this earth? So that's why I got into it. And it sounds like it was the same thing for you, but it's interesting to me that both of us, I don't know, never really. I had no idea that you were into kids, or I guess, like you said, you're not really. But like, I had no idea you even had interest in it.
Yeah.
But I do know that like you're a really good dude, so it makes sense from that standpoint. But yeah. Anyway.
Well, I do like working with kids. But the thing about school psychology, I mean, when I tell people I'm a school psychologist, most people have this picture in their mind of me being like a mental health, like a therapist working with children, like playing with blocks and stuff.
Right.
I feel like I get a good dose of working with kids in my job because, I mean, I get to work with them one-on-one, doing activities that are usually, pretty engaging for the kids. You learn a lot about how they learn. Sometimes they say some crazy shit, which is always fun. But, like, it's just a couple, like, I probably spend maybe 3 hours a week working with kids. Other than that, I'm in meetings typically.
Right. Yeah, that probably would have been a better approach for me then in hindsight, because ultimately, like, I'm considering myself retired from the game of education
for now.
I've hung them up. Yeah, we'll see. But that was it for me, man. It's like my tank, I didn't have any patience to begin with, and I knew that. And I thought after my first 3 years that was it. And I kept thinking like, nah, there's maybe some more meat on the bone there. But these past 2 years, I've gone into the school year knowing that my tank is on empty patience-wise. And then especially this last year, dude, from the jump, I knew like, this is too much. Like, I'm going fucking insane because you are just inundated with just stimulus and screaming. And more than anything, you have to be a different person. Like, I can't be my normal self in front of a bunch of kids, and that's exhausting.
Yeah.
For 8 hours a day, you have to be, like, acting, essentially, in a lot of ways. It's so exhausting. But I know there are teachers out there, like, and my mom, for instance, loves children. Mm-hmm. Like, her greatest passion in life is children. Mm-hmm. Right? So she could stay in the game for 30 years. She just retired, and if it wasn't for some health issues that she was experiencing herself, she probably would do it until the day she fucking died. So I know there's people like that, and I think those are the teachers that are going to stay in it for the long term. But for a guy like me, man, there's only, I don't know, maybe it's a character flaw in its own right, but like there's only so much like the feeling that I was making a difference could carry me through the profession, right? Because it wasn't like I was showing up every day and enjoying what I was doing necessarily. Yeah. I was enjoying the theoretical or philosophical concept of making a difference. Right. But on a day-to-day basis, on a day-to-day grind, 8 hours a day, being surrounded by children, some of, in my initial years, all of them with severe behavior issues, and these latter 2 years, certainly some of them have behavior issues, but just the sheer number. I taught PE this last year, and you just got 30 fucking 12-year-olds in a class. No way, man. It's like a nightmare.
How much of these things do you attribute to just how difficult? I mean, have you shared on the podcast with what specifically your job was when you first started as a teacher?
No, I don't think I've gone into it with any specific, whatever that word is, in any specific way. But yeah, my job my first 3 years was I taught a self-contained classroom of kids that are diagnosed with what's called, in Arizona, or I've seen at the time, is called an emotional disorder. And essentially, these kids went to a public school district, just like any traditional public school district. They got kicked out of school, and then they would be sent to our school, which was a school in that same public school district, but just for the kids that got kicked out of school. So for my first 2 years, I taught all of the fourth graders in the public school district who had gotten kicked out of school for whatever reason. Typically, repeated patterns of severe misbehavior that normally result in some sort of violent or aggressive outburst that ultimately is going to get them kicked out. My third year was with fifth graders. Same thing. All the fifth graders that had gotten kicked out of school. So it's all of these kids who don't have any cognitive impairment, like from an intellectual standpoint, they're functioning on the same level as their other kids. And so my job is to be a fourth grade teacher, just like any fourth grade teacher. I'm teaching them reading, writing, math, science, social studies. I'm with them all day long, just like any fourth grade class. But there's only 7 to 12 of them, and I have at least one other, what's called a paraprofessional or like a teaching assistant in the room with me. But these kids are fucking out of their minds in a lot of ways. It varies in severity, right. But we're talking kids on a daily basis, flipping desks, throwing things across the room, stabbing themselves or others with sharp objects, on a daily basis restraining kids like in full prone position on the ground. I still have like little scars on my hands from kids biting me and shit. Like that kind of stuff all day long. And quite honestly, dude, having the past 2 years, so this past year I taught PE to middle school and high school, and the year before that I taught, the year before that I worked just with an individual student one-on-one, which is a totally different ballgame. But 2 years ago I taught what's called a resource classroom. So those are kids who were struggling learners who just needed additional support in reading and math. But I think actually, looking back on it, I actually enjoyed it sounds like the first 3 years would be horrible, working with a classroom full of just like these terrors. But I actually enjoyed the intensity of that job because every night when I go to bed, it's like, all right, tomorrow I gotta wake up and go to fucking battle. And it's like, it's easier to get into that like teacher mode where you have to be a different person in that sense, right. Because it's more clear cut who you had to be, at least how I approached it, which was just like, listen, this is no nonsense. I'm essentially a drill sergeant. I'm like a consequence robot. Mm-hmm. Like I'm a robot here delivering academic content, and then I'm going to be dishing out consequences based on your behavior. Yeah. And I'm going to not do my very best not to get emotional about it. But I'm just going to try to continue, like even though like you're flipping your desk, I'm going to try to continue delivering the academic lesson to the rest of the class. But at the same time, like, oh, we're flipping your desk, well, to go through whatever the discipline process for the school is. This is your first warning. Now you got to go sit in timeout or whatever. It was very clear for me. It was easier for me to just be a robot. Mm-hmm. And the intensity of it, I think I actually liked. Like I get off on adrenaline situations. Like that's like a sickness I have, I think. Like I like really intense bad situations. I get like fulfilled by that.
So you had plenty of those. I mean, you did.
Yeah, I guess. But like in these last 2 years where it's a much more calm environment and like, now I have to be like a mentor to young people and like I have to be like a more nuanced educator, but I still have to be in teacher mode and I still kind of have to like treat you with baby gloves because you are a child or a young adolescent. That I didn't like so much because I don't know, man. It's I don't know. At least with the kids with the emotional disorders, the behavior kids, it was like it was one mode that I had to be in. I had to wear one hat. That's or I guess two: instructor and disciplinarian. Yeah. And these other roles, it's like I have to like be engaging with kids. And not necessarily be like friendly, but be like kind of warm and inviting, like you would think a traditional good teacher would be. Right. I found it very quickly, like, fuck, I'm not a traditional good teacher. Yeah. I'm a good like crisis handler. Mm-hmm. I'm a good like father figure for kids because every single kid I had during my 3 years of working with behavior kids, for 3 years I had one kid who had a dad in the household. Yeah. Right. So I was excellent at being that, like being that paternal figure that these kids lacked in their lives. And I was very effective at it. Yeah. But being like an actual traditional teacher, like planning lessons and like making things engaging and fun and like stimulating the interest of the kids, it wasn't for me.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, because I worked in several schools that have those types of classrooms, not to that level. But, classes with kids that have severe behavior disorders, and I've gotten to work with a lot of those teachers. And I have a lot of respect for them. But you're right, it's not traditional educator as much as it is you're possibly their parent, you're their teacher, you're their probation officer, you're their social worker, and I know you had to do that a lot. I feel like you were part social worker, part teacher.
That's the other thing too, when you have less of them, like so this past year I had 250 kids, right, being a PE teacher. I had 7 to 12 in my 3 years in Phoenix teaching behavior kids. So a huge part of my success was also developing relationships with families. And when you've got 10 kids or 7 students, I can be in contact with these moms or grandmas or foster parents on a regular basis, like at least once a week. I can be texting, I can be calling. It's not that big of a deal. And if you can really ingratiate yourself into like the family environment, and then not only start to establish like structure, routine, a sense of cause and effect and consequences for your actions in the classroom, but then by forming relationships with the parents, start to institute those sorts of structures in the household, dude, then you can really see this fucking nightmare of a 9-year-old come to you at the beginning of the year. And then by the end of the year, not only has he received all of the growth and typically more that he needed during his 4th grade year because he's in a small environment, so he can traditionally learn more. But now all of a sudden this kid has turned into like a functioning member of the classroom and the school community, and he's ready to go back to public school in a lot of cases. Yeah. That is like super rewarding and gratifying, and what kept me on board for a while. But now I just couldn't even envision going back. Like I said, I think my gas tank is empty, and I just and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, I'm always looking for what's new and different, and I can't just stay settled doing the same thing in the same place.
Yeah. But I guess my point for asking you to describe more in detail, like what kind of teaching job you had, I mean, that was pretty exceptional. That was a
unique circumstance.
Yeah, very unique.
Yeah, it was a unique circumstance. But I think it was ideal, honestly, for me as an educator. I don't know. I taught 5 years in the classroom, 7 years working in education total in various capacities. I don't know if I had been placed through the organization I was with in like a normal 5th grade classroom from the jump, or an 8th grade science teacher or whatever, if I would have stayed in it that long or not.
Yeah.
I don't know. I gotta pause real quick because I gotta go pee.
I did too.
Alright, I want to get into a little nitty gritty on special education and education a little more generally. Here's my biggest issue with special education, and I really saw it this past year at the school I was working at. This past year I worked at a charter school in DC. It's renowned in the city. Like, it's known as a really, really, really well-run school. And I will say, it is a well-run school. It's a I'll say this: very dedicated teachers work there. It's the most committed and passionate educators I've ever worked with by far. My issue with special education is, it seems the model is identify these kids who have some sort of disorder, disability, or whatever that's hindering their ability to learn or interact like at a normal level, exist in school at a normal level. And so we're going to come up with a plan to essentially make things easier for them. The company line I would always hear would be like, so they could access the curriculum in like the same way that their non-disabled peers could. My issue with that is if you're suffering from some sort of handicap, and that may be a strong word, but it's just the word I'm using, the best word I can come up with. You have some sort of handicap, be it like a cognitive impairment, be it severe behavior issues, be it autism, be it ADHD. So we're gonna like nerf the educational, pad the educational environment for you to make it easier for you so you can be successful in school. However, that's not how the world works. In real life, in adult life, once you're out of the public education system, if you have something that's holding you back, that's causing you to perform at a lower level than the other members of society, you just got to work harder or come up with some other way to be successful. So either you need to work harder or be more creative, or, in my opinion, like, you're going to have to pull something out of yourself so that you can compete at the same level with everybody else. But with these same kids that are going to suffer from, in many cases, are going to suffer from these same ailments when they are adults. We're teaching them as young people that we're going to make it easier for you here so you can compete on the same level with the people that your non-disabled peers. Shouldn't we be doing the opposite? Shouldn't we be like challenge them even further? So instead of, for instance, it's a very common thing for a kid that's in special education to like reduce his workload or reduce the amount he has to write because he struggles with writing, or reduce the number of math problems that he has to complete, or whatever. Like that's, if I had been labeled, which I should have been labeled as a special education student with my OCD, that's what would have been done for me, right? My teacher would have said like, okay, he only has to do half the math problems each night. Or like, everyone else has to write 5 pages for this essay, but he only has to write 2.5, right? Shouldn't they have done the opposite? Shouldn't they have been like, listen, buddy, things might be tough for you growing up, so let's prepare you now when there are no actual real world consequences, when we have the opportunity to prepare you for the real world. Shouldn't we be giving you more homework? Shouldn't we be giving you more math problems? Shouldn't we be making things even more challenging? So like you're building those muscles up in a safe environment where like, you know, there are structures in place to support you and there is like a safety net because you are a child. But instead we're doing the opposite. We're teaching them that like, we're going to tone things down for you. We're going to dumb things down for you. We're going to reduce the workload. We're going to reduce the requirements because you have this disability. It's like, you know, if you're an athlete and you blow out your ACL during the season, you're going to have to work that much harder than everybody else to be prepared for the next season. Every other player that didn't suffer an injury can just go through their normal training regimen and prepare for the next season. But you now with this impairment, you're going to have to grind even harder. You're going to have to do your normal training regimen, but on top of that, you're going to need to rehab that ACL. Mm-hmm. We're doing the opposite, I feel like, in special education. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and sometimes, I mean, that it's definitely all about finding kind of the middle ground, because that's a very valid point. And a lot of times, I will say that some of the most stressful meetings for me are 504 meetings, which you alluded to earlier, which is kind of like special education light. It kind of varies depending on what district you're in. But essentially 504 plans are for kids who have usually medical impairments like ADHD or epilepsy or something like that might be impacting them at school, but not to the point where they need direct special education services. They just need accommodation. So kind of like what you're talking about. So at those 504 meetings, and anybody can request a 504 meeting. You know, parents can just request at any point in time, and the school is obligated legally to hold a meeting. Those meetings get pretty dicey sometimes, because a lot of it is, you know, trying to make sure that we're not throwing a bunch of accommodations in there that A, the kid doesn't need, B, is going to be detrimental to the kid in the long run, and C, the teacher doesn't really have time to
customize her classroom for this one kid.
Exactly. Which, yeah. So I definitely see what you're saying. I definitely think you need to find a middle ground. And I'm all about IEPs that are more about, you know, building skills. I'm all about more of a focus on resilience and building resilience in kids. There's a lot of research that has been done that's come out recently, looking at different factors that can grow resilience in kids, which ends up to kind of be what you're talking about, like the grit that they need to be successful in their life. But I will say it's hard to gauge it, because a lot of students, there's also a lot of research that shows that students that have, you know, been diagnosed with learning disabilities at a very young age end up having coping skills that far surpass their same age peers when they're like in high school and college, because they've always had to work that much harder. So I mean, it's definitely very much a case-by-case basis, or case-by-case basis. But your point is well taken, that a lot of times that is what is done. And I mean, that's what happens when you have like these canned IEPs, that there's not a whole lot of thought that goes into it. Usually it's a result of that kind of situation. Yeah,
it's like I remember I used to have to write these IEPs just like you do now. And it's like, we would use a program called IEP Pro, and you just like, when you get to the accommodation section, IEP is an individualized education program. It's essentially like this massive document that can be fucking 50 pages. Where it's a lot of red tape and a lot of bureaucratic stuff, but what it boils down to is you're trying to come up with a plan that's allowing this kid to access the curriculum. in the most effective way possible. But like you'd get to the section where there's like accommodations and modifications, and so that's like the changes that are going to be made in the learning environment for this kid to like help him out, you know. And it's like you literally just select from a drop down list, right? Like have directions repeated, give written directions and oral instructions, reduce the amount of written assignments that are required, like that sort of shit. And it's, I don't know, it always struck me the wrong way. Like, man, like this kid should be getting more, like he should be spending more time in the gym, not less time in the gym to get ready for life. And at the very least, like, shit, let's have him fail now. Let's get him used to, not to like say it's inevitable that he's going to be a failure, he or she's going to be a failure in life, but let's get him used to the feeling of not being successful. Because even the most gifted person in all aspects of human existence is going to be unsuccessful at times. So let's get used to that feeling of not being successful and what it takes to like dust yourself off and get back up, because chances are you do have this disability. You are going to experience that more regularly than a kid that doesn't have any disability. I don't know, man, that always struck me the wrong way. And I can think back to like this school that I worked at this past year, man. The special education department, dude, you'd have these kids that struggled in class, right, that were like way far behind in school for whatever reason. It was a charter school. We didn't have any kids that had like severe issues. We didn't have any kids like, you know, really low IQs or things like that. But the kids essentially with learning disabilities in whatever area, they would spend at least half of their day in these classrooms, these special education classrooms that have like 5 kids in them. And they're all like kicking back in bean bags and shit. And they've got like, you know, 3 teachers in there. And they're doing like a dumbed down version of the work. And, you know, once they get done with their work, they're like playing games or doing some kind of fun activity. It's like, what the fuck are we doing here, man? Like this kid should be given a more stringent environment. Like he should have to stand while he writes to like duress academic training or something. I don't know, man. It just, I never got it. I felt like we were kind of doing them a disservice by making things easy for them, because school's a time, like I said, where the consequences aren't fucking real. You know, it's not the real world. So we have these 13 years to prepare them for how the real world is going to respond to them. And the same thing with behavior kids, which is a separate issue, but like, this wasn't the case at the behavior school I worked at. Like, we pretty much had our shit down in terms of how to handle these kids when they would go off behavior-wise. But like at the school I worked at this past year, we worked on what was called I'm sure you've heard of the term. It's real like in vogue, like productive conflict model or mediation model or something. Where basically like if these kids did something wrong in class, like cursed out a teacher or walked out of the classroom whenever they wanted, they would get to sit down with that teacher and like a third party mediator and like talk about like what they were feeling during the time that the incident occurred, and then the teacher would express how he or she felt when that occurred, and then they would come up to like, the goal would be like to come restore what they would call like the damaged relationship between teacher and student and the rest of the members of the classroom, and like we need to all like hug it out and return to the classroom the next day with this repaired relationship.
So like a restorative justice.
Restorative justice, that's what it's called. Restorative justice. Like what the fuck is that? We don't live in a restorative justice society. If you fucking rob a car, you go into a cage. For years.
I'll say there's a lot of research to support restorative justice programs.
Oh my God. And I'm not saying the criminal justice system, like we have the best criminal justice system, but like, are we preparing them for some sort of like utopian world that we want to exist, or we were preparing them for the fact that like if you commit a crime, you don't go to like some sort of mediation process between you and the person that you harmed, and you both come up to like a mutually agreeable solution, and then you're allowed to like do it over again the next day, like get a second chance. That's not how the fucking world works. What are we doing here? If you ran out of my class, like you have detention. There's a consequence for your action. I never got that. I mean, I get it conceptually, but it just seems fucking counterproductive, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean,
I've heard the same thing. There's so much research that reports restorative justice, but I was like,
well, and I think it goes back. It's more about teaching skills. Obviously, it's not going to be a situation that's analogous to something that's going to, put you in jail for 10 years. But it's about teaching skills. It's kind of similar to what you're saying, in a safe environment with a safety net, using these opportunities to teach kids skills that can translate, hopefully, to other things that might come up in their life, and hopefully going back to the neural plasticity of the brain, trying to build some connections and just build some of those skills going forward that they might not have some of the issues that you're talking about.
I'm going to throw some more critiques at you, so sorry I'm kind of bombarding you here, but how much do you think the incidence of, well, first off, do you think there's like an overclassification of special education?
Yes.
Okay. I do too. Isn't it supposed to be like something like 10% of the population?
10 to 12%, something like that.
Right. But I guess the problem that I see in the public education system is like the parents have all the power. So if the parent wants the kid, parent thinks something's up, the school is obligated to go through the whole song and dance, jump through every hoop to attempt to identify something there.
Different districts interpret it differently, but yeah.
So it's almost like you're going through this like a very rigorous process of investigating if there's an issue. You're going to come up with something. So as soon as a parent initiates like any concern, then you have to sit down with this kid and poke and prod figuratively. You're going to come up with something's going to pop up abnormal.
Yeah, a lot of the time, especially with kids that are referred for learning disabilities, the way that we do learning, it's actually undergoing some changes right now. We're hoping to get more guidance on what we can say is a learning disability and what isn't. Because you're right, you sit down and test any kid, you give them enough tests, after a while you're going to find some kind of weak area that would make them qualify.
And then from like a legality standpoint, then the district or the school is on the hook because now you've got evidence that, something came back abnormal or whatever. And so now you're almost obligated to address it in some way.
Yeah, it does put schools in a tough spot sometimes.
Yeah.
And with our job, so much of our job, a lot of times I describe us as like mediators, because like in these types of meetings, we're kind of the ones that are trying to, at least I try to be the voice of reason and try to avoid these situations. Like whenever we get a parent request for testing, we take it pretty seriously, because you don't want to get to the point where you're testing this kid and identifying him with a disability when really it's probably not in the best interest of the kid.
Mm-hmm. How much of the kids that do get placed in special education, and this, when I ask this question, the most evident like special education classification this would fall under would be an emotional disability, so behavior issues. But how much do you think is like bad parenting? Because with behavior issues, I know it's like every kid I ever had in my special education classroom that had been classified with emotional disability, maybe I can think of like two, where if you place this kid with like a better set of parents or parent, like this shit wouldn't have manifested itself. But with every other one, so 95% of them, it's like, dude, this could all be solved if there were just basic structures and competency in the household.
Yeah, and you do see that a lot. I mean, the whole family system thing is definitely big, and kind of like what you were saying about how much of an impact you could make when you had a relationship with the parents at home, and when there was kind of contingencies between home and school, between behavior. When you don't have that piece of it, it's hard to make a lot of headway, for sure.
It's the simplest thing with behavior, man. It was just teaching the kid, like, listen, if you do bad things, bad things are going to come to you. Not like, we're going to beat you, but like, if you do, something wrong, then, you're going to lose, free time. You're not going to be able to go to recess, or you're going to have like more homework or something like that. And the opposite, right? Positive consequences. So if you do something good, we're going to reward that behavior to encourage it. So if you, go through the whole school day without having an incident, then tomorrow you can have 5 minutes extra free time. It's just little shit like that. But it is astonishing to me the number of parents I come into contact with who just seem like they are treading water, trying to get through the day. Yeah. And the common thing I see is how distorted the relationship between cause and effect is in the household. That essentially has been turned upside down. Mm-hmm. So what's happening is, especially with kids' behavior issues, it's like this kid is acting out at home. In a lot of cases, not to generalize, but just in my experiences, the vast majority of cases, the single mom at home is just trying to survive whatever episode is happening. So let's say the kid is like, running around, like throwing books off the bookshelves in the house, right? Mm-hmm. Because he wants to like go get ice cream, right? And so the short-term solution to that problem to get him to stop throwing books off the bookshelf in the house is to go take him to get ice cream. And that's what I see over and over and over.
Like you said, especially for a mom that's just trying to survive.
Right. She's trying to get through the day.
She's trying to pay the rent. She's all these other environmental stressors they've got going on.
But by doing that, she is shooting herself in the foot and compounding the problem tremendously. Yeah, she should be doing the exact opposite, which is like, oh, you're going to throw books off the bookshelf. You're going to get the opposite of going to get ice cream. Like, you are grounded in your room and you're not getting dinner. Mm-hmm. Like that's what should happen. But you see constantly these parents just trying to struggle to get through the day, and so they're giving a positive consequence for negative behavior. It's the exact opposite of the cause and effect economic model that you should see. And then these kids show up at school the next day or the next several years, and it's not even their fault at that point.
Yeah, that's just their role.
Like, they've been taught, if I do bad, I get what I want.
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's the most frustrating goddamn thing.
It is. I can't imagine as a teacher. I mean, as a school psychologist, it's frustrating. I mean, there's so much, and I always feel feels so futile when I tell teachers this, just to try not to worry about what we can't control. Because I mean, that's really all you can say. I mean, there's only so much we can do as far as these kids that come from, families and parents that aren't all that effective, and sometimes don't even give a damn. I mean, you're talking about parents that care and want to, they're trying to do right. There's also plenty of kids whose parents just don't give a shit.
Yeah. Let me pause real quick and see if I have another school psychology question. 136.
Yeah, ED cases are tough. It's very hard to say that it's an emotional disability when there's so many other factors going on.
Alright, I'm gonna throw out a radical fucking theory here, or approach. So when I graduated college, I think like a lot of college students, and this also had to do with how I was raised. I was raised by a mom that taught me, whatever you do in life, especially professionally, should be essentially based on self-sacrifice and trying to improve the lives of someone other than yourself. Mm-hmm. I was very much indoctrinated into that line of thinking, an altruistic way of thinking. As I've grown up, however, and it's kind of in line with the theory I was saying about like making, it sounds harsh, but like making things more difficult for kids that are already experiencing like inherent challenges. Mm-hmm. Like, that sounds harsh on the surface, but I actually think I only say that because I think that's what's best for the kid and ultimately what's best for society. So I graduated college and was like pretty left in every way, like borderline socialist. As I've had more real world experience, I've done like a 180 basically to now I'm like basically like an anarcho-capitalist. Like, I don't believe in government at all. I think the only institution, I need to do more research on this, but I've become very libertarian and believe essentially the only functions of government should be like law enforcement, and I mean like a passive law enforcement, like a reactive law enforcement, not like patrolling the streets looking for trouble law enforcement, like sitting in a warehouse like waiting for someone to call you law enforcement. And like a judicial system that can like settle disputes amongst individuals or companies or organizations, mm-hmm. and to like protect property rights. Like, so law enforcement judicial system. When you break that down a little further, this is not neither the time or place, but yeah, I think there needs to be some sort of environmental protection mechanisms, things like that. When I think about education, and I've been tossing this around, I'm almost hesitant to say it like in a public forum like this, but it's like I've been tossing this around in my head for the past couple of years, and it's, just like I evolved as essentially a socialist in my early 20s to now like this exact opposite hardcore libertarian, my feelings on this could totally evolve in the next months and years. But like, I don't really believe in public education at all anymore. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't believe in this concept that the government gets to like what I consider steal money from people to raise other people's kids. Like, why the fuck am I getting money taken out of my paycheck every day to, like, so some chick who got knocked up down the block can send her kid to school, right? And I understand conceptually, like, well, if you don't do that, you're gonna have you're gonna have anarchy, or on your hand, you have Lord of the Flies, like everyone's gonna be running through the streets uneducated. I don't necessarily think that. Like, I think the private market could come in there. Like, if you have a kid, I think part of the thought process you're going through when you have a kid is like, okay, I'm gonna have to somehow educate this kid. So I'm gonna have to somehow turn this kid into like a productive member of society, right? So I'm either gonna do that on my own with like some sort of whole school form, or I have to pay for this kid to go to school, right? And then obviously there's unintended pregnancies, right? Obviously there's cases where a family will not have the financial means to give these kids to pay for the kid to go to a private school. But I believe personally that like economic forces would take over and nonprofit organizations would make schools for kids whose parents couldn't afford to send them to a private school, and essentially like all that would work itself out economically. And I think with the prevalent, how many nonprofit organizations there are, even though the government plays a role in education, I definitely think that is a viable model. I know it's radical, I know it's extreme. I don't know, what is your thought on just like public education in general? To me, it just seems like we're making it way too easy for people to reproduce. Like, if you have a kid, you don't have to worry about a babysitter between the ages of 5 and 13.
Yeah.
Like, and so you can just send your kid off for the government to raise it for its whole life. So like, there's no consequences of having like real world consequences of having a kid. I don't know, I just feel like it's too easy for us to reproduce at this point. And like, it would really help from a family planning perspective and like a reproduction perspective and an overpopulation perspective if like parents knew that they had to be responsible for their kids' education. It wasn't just a given, right? We don't live in fucking 1750 where like we're trying to prepare a workforce to go live in work in factories and shit.
Right.
I think we just got this system that's been in place for centuries now, that was created to normalize children and equip them with the basic skills they need to go work in some sort of industrial job, right? And now what it's turned into is just like glorified babysitting in a lot of ways. I know the charter school that I worked at this past year, you have to market yourself as a charter school, right? It's a business at the end of the day. So like, we would have an extended school day, which means the kids can come earlier than they would in a normal public education school. We start earlier and we stay later. Dude, we wasted so much goddamn time during this the kids in high school and middle school would have an hour lunch and a 30-minute brunch. So an hour half of the day. Brunch. They would eat for 5 minutes at lunch and then just run fucking wild outside or like in the hallways playing Fortnite on the computers, right? So like, we've got this extended school day that ostensibly is supposed to be like, you're sending your kid here to get a better education. But no, we're running a business here, man. We're giving you longer babysitting hours. You can drop your kid off earlier, you can stay at work later, or you have some time to go to the gym after work. I'm not fucking educating your kid. So I don't know, man. This whole system seems kind of fucked up. That public education isn't so much about educating. It's about, we have a model now where in the economic system that we exist in, you have to work a 9-to-5 job, and if we're going to sustain the human population, people do need to reproduce. But if we're going to sustain a capitalist system, people need to go to work and grind at least 8 hours a day, every day. So we need to do something with all these kids who can't take care of themselves. It's like, let's just send them to the brick building down the street, and then mom and dad can pick them up after they're done fucking punching numbers in the computer all day.
Is it more that concept that bothers you, or is it more that you don't think that education is basically worth what it's supposed to be?
So I think it's both, right? So I think first off, I think parents should be responsible for educating their own kids. I don't believe that the government should be responsible. I don't think the government's role should be educating children.
And so by that, you mean the parents should be responsible for finding the school they want to pursue and pay for that.
Right.
So, right.
Yeah. So yeah, I believe in, just like I would believe with healthcare, just like a purely private model, you buy your insurance, right? If you want medical insurance, you buy insurance. Otherwise, you're going to show up to the doctor and pay the asking price. Same thing with school. It's like, listen, if you don't want a fucking little hellion on your hands, if you want your child to, have some skills when he grows up, you need to fucking pay for him to go to school.
Yeah.
That's what I believe. Additionally, I believe the current model wastes so much fucking time. Like, I think we could probably cut it off at like 8th grade, right? You learn to read, write, do basic arithmetic, you learn basic principles of science and like civics and governance, and then maybe some algebra. And then you're good. From there, like, okay, let's start like pursuing like creative endeavors, something you're actually interested in. Start getting your hands dirty. Like, why are we sitting these kids down in a seat for hours on end to learn about like physics or like advanced calculus and shit that we had to take in high school?
Yeah.
Like,
have you done much research like different countries, how they do it?
No,
in
not really.
France?
Dude, all this comes with a caveat. This is just my remnants of OCD still remain in terms of like my ability to read. So I do very little reading. I listen to a lot of podcasts, but not very many that are like education centric by any means. Really, everything I'm saying right now is just me like talking shit. But it's shit that I believe in, that I've given thought to.
And it's pretty topical. I mean, this kind of stuff with charter schools is privatizing education is kind of popular these days. But like in France, and I'm not sure if this is right or not, but I want to say I remember learning about the education model in France. It's essentially that at some point in their middle school years, I don't know if they take a test or they decide whether or not, okay, this kid is going to go to university or this kid is going to learn how to like do a trade.
Right.
So it's kind of the same kind of thing. They learn those basic skills and get to the age where they feel like they have a good idea of what kind of future this kid needs to pursue.
Yeah, that's what I would feel like, and I'm a crazy person, but I feel like I would have a kid, and my ideal situation would be like, I have a kid, I have the means to educate him in my home, and I know for a fact I could do that in a much more efficient way than the public education system could. I could get him equipped with all the essential academic skills by puberty, by the time he's hitting puberty. And then it would be great to, I don't know, send that kid out into the world to like try out different shit. Have him like write his own books or whatever the fuck he wants to do. Send him to Africa to like work on a fucking, I don't know, like palm oil plantation. I don't know, like just have life experience rather than sitting in a box for 7 more years than is necessary. Yeah. Right? Dude, it's so inefficient, man. And this is the other thing. Think about how this education system and the existence of compulsory education in the United States, and once again, I don't know the facts, right? But it's existed since, this education system, let's say, that we've had in the United States has essentially existed since the beginning of this country. Early 1900s?
Compulsory education, yeah.
Okay. But would you agree that, like, the concept of, like, kids leaving their home, going to a schoolhouse, sitting in a desk in the schoolhouse, the teacher being at the front of the room delivering a lesson, the kids being at their desk like following along, that would have existed prior to the 1900s, right? Isn't that like how shit worked?
I'm sure in some communities, but I don't know. It might be more kind of like what you're saying it should be. I mean, I feel like a lot of kids would have been, quote unquote, homeschooled.
Right.
But also the whole, the economy depended on child labor, so that's a lot of why at the turn of the century the economy changed. Compulsory schooling became
so compulsory schooling. So compulsory schooling early 1900s. So let's say 120 years. But I think the actual model of how academics is delivered in terms of like kids showing up to a classroom in a school, teachers standing at the front of the room, kids at their desk.
Right.
I have to look into it, but I think that probably existed prior to that. But even if we just start with compulsory education, let's say 100 years, and I would say maybe 200 years for the model, the structure that we have for delivering knowledge to children. Let's say 200 years. Think about how much the world has changed over the last 100 to 200 years, and every other facet of life, how we have evolved, and the way that we communicate with each other, and the way that we get from one place to another. in like the types of jobs we do, in our relations with people of different races, like how radically different the world is today than it was in 1900.
Yeah.
But yet the education system is essentially the exact fucking same system, right? You kids, anywhere from 15 to 30 kids show up to a box. Inside of that box is a bunch of other little boxes. The kids walk into their little boxes. They sit down at another smaller box, which is their desk. So you got 25 kids staring at the front, all facing the same direction, staring at the one adult at the front of the room who's like writing on a board. Right, and there's definitely been a little bit of innovation exactly how that works.
There's been a lot of innovation. I mean, the general construct is still very similar, obviously.
But if you walk through a school today and you peek into each classroom, that's essentially what you're going to see. It's kids sitting at desk, a teacher at the front of the room talking. Yeah, there is more like kids like working in groups and pairs and shit and stuff like that. But basically the concept is still the same. It's like, how have we not evolved this model with the way the world has evolved so dramatically in every other area of life? Yeah. The essential thing is still the same. You send them to a building and they go sit in a box.
So compared to the exponential change that the world has experienced, education, but I mean, it's just like any other thing that requires government legislation to make moves. It's going to take a minute.
Right, which goes back to my theory. It's like and the reason, that was my next point. Maybe I was setting it up. I wasn't trying to set it up. But yeah, the reason, in my opinion, you've seen such lack of innovation is because the government has a monopoly on education. Right?
Could be.
It's this big fucking monolith that takes just takes forever to turn around the Titanic.
Yeah.
And we've essentially, the vast majority of people know, like, oh, just let the government take care of it, and I'll send the kid to the public school.
And I mean, a lot of this is based on the schools that I've worked in and the kids that I've worked with. I mean, and the number one concern would probably be the inequality that potentially could result from it all being privatized. I mean, when there's not so much control over how education's done, I mean, is that not a big concern for you, that there'd be inequality with what kids get, what kind of education? I mean, you're putting a lot of impetus on these parents to know what's right for their kids, put any kind of thought into it, having the financial means. I mean, it's kind of, you want to...
My counter to that would be, and I know it's a simple explanation, but it's what libertarians do, right? You just go back to like the market would take care of it, right? So like the shitty schools would go out of business, right? You can technically, as a public school, go out of business, but like it takes for fucking ever because you're subsidized by the government. You're getting an automatic cash flow every year based on how many kids are in your school. If you're a shitty school in the real world, I shouldn't say the real world, this is the real world. If you're a shitty school based on a private model, if you're not providing quality education, parents stop sending your kid there and they find somewhere else. Yeah. And so competition amongst the schools is going to breed higher and higher levels of education. Mm-hmm. The major flaw, I think, in that, and my utopian libertarian vision, is poor kids. Yeah. But I genuinely think, just like nonprofit organizations do now, there are plenty of people who are, either very wealthy or feel perfectly fine financially or just have a big heart or whatever, and nonprofit organizations would fill that gap.
The whole gap, you think?
I think so, yeah. No one wants to see fucking little kids like begging on the side of the road in the United States in 2018. No, I don't think that a society this advanced would ever let that happen. I think nonprofits, just like the teachers, I mean, think about every teacher the vast majority of teachers are in education now. Mm-hmm. They would still be in education, right? If they work at a nonprofit school, it would be easier. You'd have so much more flexibility to like open your own school and not have to follow the rules of the government. It would just be this fucking like arena of innovation and creativity, just like any other area that's not dominated by the government. It's just like fucking cell phones or whatever, right? If you don't have like the U.S. federal government phone, right, and everyone gets it, if you did, there would never be any innovation in cell phones because everyone would get their free U.S. government phone, right? Yeah. And areas where the market is allowed to thrive, yes, people fall by the wayside. There is failure. But ultimately, in the long run, the trajectory is progress, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's how fucking economics works, man. The trajectory is progress. Things get better in the aggregate. Money is made in the aggregate. Kids would learn in the aggregate because the shitty schools would die off.
Yeah. And I'm like you, I feel like I need to read more about it.
Yeah, I don't have read shit. I'm just fucking, like I said, I'm just talking shit. But I think it's an interesting thought experiment to go through at the very least. How long? So, what do you like foresee in terms of like your trajectory in this profession and education? Do you think you'll stay in this long term? Do you have any other ambitions? Like, what do you anticipate happening in professional life and role in education?
I foresee myself being in education. I try to take it like 3 to 5 years at a time.
Uh-huh.
I always said, when I first started out, I said I would get to 30 and kind of reevaluate and see what I want to do.
That's this year.
So that was this year.
And so you're on board for another 3 to 5.
Yeah, I think so.
How many years have you been in it?
This will be my 7th, including my intern year, which was basically the same job that I do now. But I think about it all the time, about different things I might really want to do. But it always kind of comes back to education and just kind of, I don't know, I feel like I'm doing this for a reason. I do still kind of have that feeling that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing for right now.
And your primary motivating factor continues to be like you feel like you're having an impact in people's lives.
Yes, or I feel like I'm working towards a more global impact.
Okay.
I feel like hopefully the culmination of what I'm doing and what I'm trying to do will end up being fulfilling. It doesn't matter as much to me on a day-to-day basis, if that makes any sense.
I totally makes sense.
I don't need the immediate gratification so much as just kind of knowing that I'm working towards something that is worthwhile.
No, dude, I hear you. That's exactly how I felt in education. It's just a different role that we played in the system, right? It's like, on a day-to-day basis for me, it just got to a point where it was like the day-to-day headache was not, the juice was not worth the squeeze of like what I felt like I was doing on an aggregate long-term
for sure.
like, global level.
For sure.
Would you ever want to like, okay, so let's say you do stay in education. Mm-hmm. Would you ever envision like having a different role, a different job, approaching from a different angle?
I've given that some thought. I mean,
like you don't this is like a corporate ladder to climb in the school psychology world, like taking like a managerial position. Like, well, how does that work?
I mean, that would like being the director of psych services for a district, maybe, but I'm not sure that would be as fulfilling. It depends. It all depends on what school district you're in. And this point in my life, that kind of job, it's just a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Same with like principals. I was actually talking to the HR guy in my last school district before I came here when I did my exit interview. He was just talking to me about how hard it is to get young people our age, like our generation, to want to be like administrators. Just because it's so, for what it is, for how much you have to invest, the pay and the benefits that come along with it are just, compared to other industries, it's just not worth it.
And I think we bounce around our generation a lot. Like we dabble in different careers and shit. Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, I've given thought to having eventually, if I stay in the game long enough, like a district leadership type position. But honestly, I'd kind of rather just stay in a school psychology role and then maybe do other things on the side. I've started writing kids' books, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This was news to me.
Yeah. I've written one. I'll let you read it.
Tight.
Yeah.
So if you ever weren't working as a school psychologist, well, would you envision doing something like that?
Yeah, I think being an author would be a pretty cool job.
Like a children's author? Or
no.
author?
I don't think I have the skill set to be an author, like to be a novelist, but I think that'd be a really cool job. I think it'd be cool to write screenplays, like in Hollywood. I mean, like just completely left field.
That's what I'm talking about.
I think that'd be tight to try to do that kind of thing.
Let's talk about that. So if you were just totally out of the box, like total shift in professional trajectory, something like that, something in terms of sounds like writing,
creative, something like that.
Okay,
that's probably what I would try to do. But I mean, if, like I said, it'd be cool to be able to keep my current career and keep the paycheck, and then kind of do something like that on the side.
Well, yeah, and then I want to close out with this too. So you're recently married. You got married in October. Are the two of you and Jenny, your wife, are you planning on having kids in the next few years as well?
Probably the next 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years. So that would influence, obviously, your decision as well.
Yeah.
It would make more sense, right? Just to stick with what you knew and the consistency of what you knew.
Yeah, that's going to be a shit show. I tell people that I work with all the time that have kids, I don't know how they function. Like, I can barely get myself to work. And, like, my coworkers that have, 3 kids under the age of 5, females, they come in like looking fresh as a daisy, and like got their makeup on and stuff, and I roll out of bed like 10 minutes before I'm supposed to be at work.
Yeah, dude.
So that's going to be a game changer. I can't see myself being able to handle much more than that, at least in the early years. I don't know how people do that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking my mom, man, she works the same job you do, and did so while raising 3 kids with no financial assistance from my dad whatsoever. It literally does not seem possible when I think about it.
It really doesn't.
Like, especially, working in the field, right? Working in education, just like you, there's so many times like, dude, I'm barely making it through the day. Especially this past year when I was teaching, it was like, by the time this school day is over, I just barely got over the finish line.
And like the only thing that's getting me through the day is knowing that when I go home, I can just lay down and just take a nap for 4 hours.
Exactly.
Eat dinner and then go to bed.
I don't know, man. I guess maybe, we don't know. We've never had kids, but I don't know. Maybe it's something like primitive in our, the genetics that like once that responsibility is there, you just like something bigger comes out of you.
It's got to be. And I mean, seeing like all of the very challenged families that I work with, I feel like it's going to be very eye-opening one day when I have my own kids and I look at some of these families that have a lot of obstacles that I will never have never had, just by the grace of God. And sometimes you question their parenting, but then I feel like there will be a day when I have kids and I'm just like, holy shit, that lady had her shit together. Like
totally,
compared to how
I'm fucking drowning here.
Yeah. How did she do that?
Yeah. What have y'all talked like specifics? What would be the plan? Like, do both y'all want to keep working?
Yeah, we want to keep working. So it's funny when you were talking about the whole, education system as a mass child care system. That's definitely something that I hope to benefit off of.
No, totally. That's what I'm saying, man. It's like,
yeah.
If I'm going to have a kid, like, I don't have to worry about him when I'm at work.
Well, like, that's what I told, and I've talked to my coworkers that have kids, like young families, and they've kind of influenced this thought, but I was just like, Jenny, if we have kids, I think we should like space them apart in like 5 years. So that way, at least one of them is getting, babysitting at school. You don't have to pay for 2.
Right.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's hard to wrap my mind around being a father, parenthood.
Dude, tell me about it. Yeah.
Especially now that like our friends are starting to have kids and have like young children, it's mind-boggling to me. Which is funny because I guess because my parents, got married when they were in their 20s, were having kids by their late 20s. So like even in college, probably even in grad school, I was thinking I'd probably follow the same route, but it just hasn't.
I want to get. We're 2 hours in here, and I do want to wrap it up. But this was the last thing I had on my list. We had such a sense to talk about education. I was kind of just thinking about ignoring it. But I do want to get your perspective too. Maybe I'll get all of our friends' perspective on this. When you went to college, did you? Okay, so this is how I put it in Hunter's podcast. We went to college. We went to University of Georgia. It's a big party school. We did a lot of that. And then we graduated college. And then all of a sudden, this is just from my perspective, all of a sudden, it seemed like everyone was immediately an adult. Everyone immediately started getting married. And now some of it, we're 30, so all of our friends are basically the same age that we went to college with. Some of them now have, 2-year-old kids? And some people who we weren't so good friends with have like multiple kids, or 5-year-old kids.
Yeah.
Like, having witnessed all of that over the last 8 years since we graduated in 2010, I feel like I didn't get a memo that everybody else got that like college is either like your last hurrah of childhood and or the place where you're looking for your life partner. Not just like it's something much more than just like the the evolution of your academic education or the advancement of your academic education. That's what I thought college was. I thought we were going to college to gain like intensive and specific knowledge in an academic area that we were interested in. But it seems to me that we were going to college, or everyone else was going to college, to like wrap up childhood and then immediately begin adulthood.
It's like a jumping off point for adulthood.
Totally.
Yeah.
Is that how you envisioned it when you went?
That's funny. I haven't thought about it. That's tough. I don't know what I thought college was going to be. I think I was just so excited to go to Georgia. Like, I'm not sure what I thought about it beforehand, but I do kind of have the same thought. Well, it is a little bit different for me because I did go to grad school for 3 years after college. So in a lot of ways, it kind of helped me to kind of, once I finished grad school, I was like, okay, I'm an adult now. Because at that point I was 25. All my friends had been working for like 3 years. They were already, most of our friends got married while I was in grad school, I feel like.
Right.
So it kind of gave me some time. I feel like I had 8 years or 7 years to kind of go through the college experience. Damn, that's a tough question. I mean, I was probably more like you, thinking it was more of an academic thing, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that I had some inkling of an expectation that I would meet my wife in college.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, I kind of figured that's where it would happen. But again, it could be because, my parents, who were the model for me for that kind of thing, I mean, they met in high school and dated all throughout college.
Right.
So it could have just been what I'd always known, that I just assumed that I would meet my wife in college. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think I told the story on the Hunter's podcast as well, but the first time that even occurred to me that like, oh fuck, wait a second, y'all are all about to be adults after this shit is done, was when we were driving down, what was it, sophomore year spring break, when we went to Fort Lauderdale, and we were driving down, it was me, Lenny, and Jimmy in a car, and Lenny like made some half-joking comment about like, oh, you and Yito gonna get married? Something like that, and Jimmy responded in all seriousness like, yeah, probably a year or two after college, like once I get all my loans paid off. And I was like, what? The first time it ever occurred to me, like, wait a second, like that's the next phase of life, is like degree and then like immediate adulthood. Never even crossed my mind, and obviously it still hasn't crossed my mind, but I don't know, man. I really did feel like everyone else, I thought we were all like playing the same game, but y'all were playing like a far more intense game than I was. So like the stakes were a lot higher or something, or like I just wasn't aware of like what exactly we were doing.
It's funny, I still remember in grad school when me and David were living together in Tallahassee. I guess David had talked to Ford before I had a chance to, when he told us he was going to propose to Adrian. It was like our first year in grad school. Was Ford, he must have been the first one that got married. I can't remember though.
Yes, he was.
But I just remember thinking, holy shit.
He got married. Yeah, I think he was. Ford's a good friend of ours in college, and I think he got married our first year out of college.
Got engaged at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember it was super heavy. I was like, holy shit.
Okay.
And I mean, I wasn't, obviously I had more of that kind of expectation than you did, but even I was like, damn, like he's happy. So
you started dating your now wife towards the end of our sophomore year?
Yeah, it was like March of our sophomore year. So she was a freshman.
Okay.
And then we dated all throughout college, grad school.
Ever since?
Multiple cities, yeah.
At what point did you know, like, oh, I'm marrying this chick?
My first year at Florida State in Tallahassee.
Okay.
Just being away from her. I just realized that I didn't want to have to be away from her. That's what kind of did it. So I was 23, I guess, 22.
And then you knew at that point it's just a matter of like getting life settled and then we'll get married?
Yeah, and it was probably more, I mean, if she wanted to get married while we were in college, I would have been like, sure, let's do it. As far as, committing and being married, it was more just, getting settled, but also, I mean, she wasn't in a rush to do the whole wedding thing. I wasn't in a rush. We both knew we were going to be together. We were living together, so we always kind of, because I mean, we got asked all the time, we've been dating for 8 years before we got engaged, close to 8 years. People always asked, especially around here, living in Greenville, South Carolina, why we hadn't got married, why I hadn't made an honest woman out of her. Yeah,
that's the other thing. I think it's also a Southern thing too.
Absolutely.
But I was raised in the South, right? My whole life. I was born in Louisiana. I grew up in Atlanta. I was raised in the South. The only distinction there being I was raised by a single mom. And she never really dated. She had one boyfriend who was like off and on, who was a really good guy, but he ended up dying when I was in high school. So there wasn't even, I guess I just wasn't even exposed to like this concept of like matrimony or like committed long-term relationships. And on top of that, both sides of my family were just disastrous, just a litany of fucking divorces. So I guess, you know, I was kind of not opposed, but like reticent on the concept of marriage from the jump. But the other thing is, yeah, we live in the South. And so we talked about this yesterday. Yesterday, I just went off and walked. We're in Greenville, South Carolina, where Griffith lives now. And yesterday, I just went around and walked around the city by myself. And it's like shocking the amount of couples, married couples, women with rings on their big ass rings on their finger, in their mid to late 20s, early 20s, some of them.
Yeah, probably.
Like, if you saw someone in their 30s, they would like look out of place. Like
their second marriage.
Yeah, exactly. Walking around like with their dog. Yeah. A lot of them childless. I would say maybe like half childless with a dog, and then half with young kids in a stroller. Yeah. It's crazy. It's like the thing. It's like how it is, and I guess it's how the world works. I still like don't quite understand that that's how the world works.
But Greenville, South Carolina is a pretty good microcosm, I think, of the South in that respect.
Yeah, I think it's probably it's particularly intense even here for the South. Like I lived the past year in DC, and I don't know any married couples. And I was hanging out with people in their late 20s, early 30s.
Even Arizona, wasn't that different?
Yeah, except I do know a lot of people that were in the Teach for America cohort that like got married after our few years in Arizona.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess DC would be the opposite. DC is just kind of like a single professional city. Like I didn't know any. I knew one married couple who was like of our age. Other than that, it's just a bunch of single people. Yeah. Maybe some people with like a long-term girlfriend, but like a lot more like variability. Like a lot more like shorter-term relationships in and out. I don't know.
Yeah.
So no, that's a huge thing I want to explore as I do this series, podcast series with our close friends over the next couple of weeks. Is this whole concept of marriage and starting a family and trying to wrap my head around what that means, because I feel like a total novice to all of this. I feel like a fucking 10-year-old learning how babies are made, honestly. So you and I didn't want to get too deep in that with you, because I feel like I would want to get into education and psychology stuff with you. I think that you have a unique perspective on all that. But yeah, you'll probably be hearing, I know there'll be more. That'll be definitely a prominent theme.
Yeah, you got some good ones coming up for that.
I know, man. I do. And I don't want to be repetitive, but I do want to keep getting, like, I guess I'm afraid some of the perspectives are going to be the same. We'll see once I ask the questions. But I do want to keep hammering that issue home, because, I want this podcast to be about things that like the questions I have about life, and then hopefully, other people out there have similar questions, and, hearing y'all talk gives them a good perspective to either, confirm their perspective of life, or to give them an entirely different perspective on life. And then for me, having these conversations with you and our other sorts of friends is definitely a different perspective. But I value it a ton, man. I love you all to death, and I love you, man. Thank you for doing this.
Love you too. Anytime.